millions are spent on determining the structural integrity of automobiles, while we met some guys who take a less scientific approach. That's this week on Motoring 98.
TSN's Motoring 98 is brought to you by Quaker State. The big Q stands for quality, always has, always will, and Midas for new, longer-lasting, performance friction carbon metallic brake pads.
The junkyard, the final resting place. It's hard to believe that once these vehicles were the apple of someone's eye. It's also hard to believe that this brand new $135,000 300 horsepower NSX could someday end up back there. But only time will tell. We'll have to wait. But I'll guarantee you there is one place this car will never end up other than my driveway, and that's the subject of our first story.
A ballet of destruction was celebrated recently in Kingston, Ontario, as these modern-day gladiators applied their craft.
We've got a big regional demolition derby here today. It's cars from all over Ontario that have competed throughout the year, qualified to come to our big one here. We've got 52 cars here today. They've come from as far away as Orono, Navan, Picton, Trenton, Sterling, Kingston, Deserana, Tyendinaga Territory, Belleville, and probably a few parts unknown also.
You guys and gals want to see men? Men, you've got them. No mice in this bunch. Men all the way through. 100% pure men.
Yeah, actually, there's a lot of rules that come into play here, and that's why P&R Demolition Derby Productions, we've never had a serious accident in any of our derbies. All drivers must remove their gas tanks. They must take all the glass, all the plastic, all the lights and everything out of their vehicles, and move their gas tanks into their back seat. They must move the batteries into the front seat. They must have fire extinguishers. They must have seat belts all in operation. And as you can see in stock cars, they put a mesh on the driver's side of the car. Here, we don't allow that simply because if there is a fire, we want the driver to be able to get out as fast as possible.
Mr. Hamburger, out right, out of Tweed. He's also a belly block champ. Take your time now. Yes, what about the hard knock?
That's right. It was good. It was sure hard getting there, but it was a good run. We're looking to do it again, that's for sure.
Hell of a taxi ride.
Oh, thank you very much. Call Modern Taxi anytime.
Yeah, there's 10 heats today, and the process leading to the final is that the first and second place out of each heat then go to a compound, and then after 45 minutes of being able to fix their cars, they go back in to compete for the $2,000 of prize money. What you're going to see is cars up on their trailers being jacked down, and as you may be able to hear, they're going to be cutting all the metal out that's been crushed into the engine and stuff, and try to bring all the metal from the engine and straighten it out.
We're cooking. That's right. Hit it here. Hit that. More.
I've been in it since '83 and it looked fun. I just had an old wagon, I thought I'd try it. And we've been derbying ever since. How you doing now? Ready? Coming. We're just wiring the hood here and got to put some Maiden's oil in the rad and we're ready to go. Mom, you didn't hear that. What kind of person it takes to be a demolition driver? Well, somebody that's half crazy, I guess. Yeah. Just more nerve than Dick Tracy, put it that way. You're worried about some guy kind of hitting you in the door and two at once and all this other, but you got to keep watching, I guess. Keep your eyes open. Just stay away from the best car you think's out there, and just try to stay out of the road. But you got to still hit, so try to go for the tires or their rad. Charlie! Hey! How's it feel, new champ? Good, good. I feel real good. Excellent. Nice to win.
Tell me about that.
Well, I just pounded. I just love to pound. Just love to pound. No, it was good. It's good, good, good. What can I say? I'm just excited, and I could use the coin, eh? Yeah, I'll talk to you in a while. I gotta have a beer.
What can a princess and a track star tell us about traffic safety? It's coming up later on Kenzie's Corner.
On this edition of Test Drive, we take a look at the Plymouth Prowler, a vehicle that graphically demonstrates what happens if you raid the corporate parts bins, stir in a little imagination and a great deal of ingenuity. Prowler's largest single unique component is its all-aluminum perimeter frame. As well as supporting the vehicle and its running gear, the frame acts as a test bed for new technologies. One of the problems presented Chrysler was, how do you take a front-wheel drive powertrain and adapt it to Prowler? The answer is surprisingly simple. You mount the engine here, you go back to the back wheels, and you put a traditional front-wheel drive transaxle at the back of the car. You then link the two with a torque tube. Now you've taken a front-drive powertrain and adapted it to the hot rod norm, rear-wheel drive. Yet another problem for Prowler: how on earth do you accommodate a spare tyre and jack in a trunk that will barely hold your toothbrush and your birthday suit? Again, the answer is simple. You turn to Goodyear and their Eagle GSD run-flat tyres. Now you no longer need a jack, spare tyre or lug wrench. The engine itself is a 3.5-litre double overhead cam 24-valve unit that puts out 214 horsepower and 221 pounds-feet of torque. At first blush, you tend to want more power. However, examine the power-to-weight ratio and that view changes quickly. Throttle response is quick, the power band wide, and getting from rest to 100 kilometers an hour takes but 7.5 seconds. Truth told, power is not an issue. To get the appropriate sound out of the Prowler, Chrysler have baffles inside here. It gives it a nice raspy roar when you stand on it. The other noise you can hear is the fan for the transmission cooler. No room for it in the trunk, they stuck it under there. And no, it's not a parachute. Inside the Prowler you'll find bits and pieces from a variety of different vehicles. Obviously some from the LH vehicles, some from the minivan, even some from the Dodge Ram pickup. The one thing they did bring over and modify was the auto stick transmission. In the original version it automatically upshifts. In other words, it's got a built-in self-preservation mode. In Prowler, because it's a hot rod style vehicle, it does not upshift. You, the driver, must remember to do it. The front suspension shows you the ingenuity I referred to earlier. What it is, double wishbones, but instead of being a commonplace system, what they've gone is to a push rod design, which places the springs and shocks inboard of the whole design. This means there's no nasty springs and shocks cluttering up the outside. This thing also enables this car to handle very tenaciously. The rear suspension is of the 4-link variety, comprising of 2 upper lateral links, 1 trailing link and a lower control arm. The rear springs and shocks were borrowed from Viper, but modified to suit Prowler, and both ends feature roll bars. From a handling perspective, the suspension obviously helps, but it's the ginormous 295/40 rear tyres that are mounted on 20-inch rims that contribute the most. Ride-wise, the Prowler is just too firm. Firm enough indeed to exaggerate the amount of body flex to the point where it can disrupt the overall road manners. Well, that's it for this edition of Test Drive. You know, some have suggested that this car was designed for those with a very fat wallet and a very small ego. And I'm sure there's some double entendre in there somewhere. However, I view this as the perfect vehicle to showcase your technical prowess. Perhaps the only drawback? When the weather turns like this, not only is it difficult to see out from the inside, this car also becomes decidedly squirrely.
When General Motors redesigned the Pontiac Transport, it knew they had to play catch-up to Chrysler, who would set the benchmark in the minivan market. Well, after 6 months and over 13,000 kilometers, it says here that GM is closing the gap and real fast. The 3.4 V6 with 180 horsepower is the only carryover from the old model, and it still tops in this segment. Now, the rugged look to the transport should also appeal to buyers of sport utilities who wouldn't be caught dead in a minivan.
I used to think the remote side door was a bit of a gimmick, but boy, it grows on you and becomes quite useful, especially when you've got an armful of groceries. But my main pet peeve comes with the seats, not the front seats. They're terrific. In fact, they feel like first class, and back here economy, simply because these are extremely uncomfortable. The reason, this part is just too short. Well, GM realizes that, and they have come up with a solution. They've extended this area of the seat by an inch in the 98 model, and they're much more comfortable.
On our next update, we'll wrap things up with some final thoughts and final figures on operating costs.
Konnichiwa. This is the 32nd annual Tokyo Motor Show, the place Mazda chose to launch their all-new Miata. Now, along with the Miata, there are a number of other cars that may find a home in a driveway near you soon, or at least we hope so. Dimensionally speaking, the new Miata is about the same size as the current model. However, beneath the skin, a lot of work has been put into stiffening the chassis, lowering the roll center, and generally improving the road manners. Under the hood, the 1.8-litre engine continues, but now boasts 140 horsepower. Obviously, the look is all new, with a very nice faux spoiler built into the rear deck lid, and at long last, those confounded pop-up headlights have been replaced with conventional units. For the Japanese market, Miata will be offered with a 6-speed manual gearbox. Sadly, we will only see a 5-speed manual and an automatic. The new Miata will appear in Mazda showrooms near you in the spring of '98. You probably don't recognize the name Suzuki Escudo, however you will soon learn to like this vehicle, because this will replace the Suzuki Sidekick probably in and around the 1999 model year. Now, not only will it bring fresh looks, it'll bring what this vehicle has always needed, and that's a V6 engine. More power, better looks, it should now be competitive. Elsewhere around the show, there were concepts from all the domestic companies, some destined to make it to production, others just pie-in-the-sky designers' dreams. Well, there you have it, a look at the weird, wacky and decidedly wonderful from Tokyo. However, before we go, my choice of show is this thing. It would single-handedly cure Toronto's traffic problem.
Our Midas tip of the week concerns wheel selection when purchasing a new vehicle. A lot of today's vehicles have more than one choice when it comes to selecting the road wheels you're going to have on that vehicle. Now, the best looking wheels are generally these cast aluminum ones like on the front of this pickup truck. They're great looking and they're very lightweight. By being lightweight, it reduces unsprung weight, which makes for very nimble, precise handling on the vehicle. The downside to these things is they tend to leak around the rim when they get a little bit of corrosion on there, and when the clear coat finish gets chipped off, they can end up being ugly and blotchy looking. I'm sure you've seen road wheels that were in a real mess after 3 or 4 winters. Now, the other side of the coin is this road wheel right over here. This is what we call a styled steel wheel, and many vehicles have this as their base wheel, or it may be an available option. It doesn't look quite as good, but it sure doesn't look bad, and the upside to this is the fact that they're very durable. It's unheard of to have rim leaks on these things. They are a little bit heavier, so the handling isn't quite as crisp. But when these things get nicked or chipped, it's a simple matter to take a piece of sandpaper and a $5 can of spray paint and make them look like brand new. Now, if you've got the aluminum alloy wheels and you want to make those old ones look like new, you're talking about $100 to $150 per wheel and 2 or 3 days of downtime while they're out being refinished. So you might want to think about this if you're planning to keep that vehicle looking good for a long time. That's your Midas tip of the week.
A portion of Motoring 98 is brought to you by the Solder Seal Gunk family of automotive products, makers of Puncture Seal Gold and Liquid Wrench.
Recently, we drove into the mountains near Canmore, Alberta, to check out a new lineup of tires by Yokohama dubbed Geolander. The tire is aimed at the sport utility and light truck market.
They're new for us. in that our previous generation of light truck tires was primarily targeted to the commercial type user. The first tire we have is called the Geolander HT. HT stands for Highway Touring. At the opposite ends of the spectrum is the Geolander MT, which stands for Mud Terrain. It's designed for the serious enthusiast who really does a lot of off-roading, or as we like to say, on-road, off-road, no-road. In the middle, we have the AT, or the all-terrain, so it kind of gives you a good compromise between a pure highway tire and a tire that's purely designed for off-road use.
If you think about your palm, the tire contact patch on the road is as big as this one. So you're relying on 4 of them to stop your 1.5-ton vehicle traveling at more than 100K. So we try to do everything possible technically to make better use of this contact patch as big as your palm.
One of the unique things about the Geolander MT tire is what we call the terraced center groove. The center groove is used to give you cornering traction. However, what happens is normally the edge would round off as the tire wears, but having a terraced effect means you constantly have a sharp edge to bite in cornering. The side benefit of it is also that the tire won't retain rocks. Not just eject them, it won't retain them to begin with. We're currently the 7th largest tire company in the world. Certainly, we've made a name for ourselves in the performance market. We've addressed the family tire market, and now we're aggressively addressing the sport utility market.
This week I want to talk about the procedure for starting a flooded engine. In the fall, winter, and early spring, whenever the ambient temperature is low and the weather is quite blustery, we tend to get quite a few service calls where the customer calls in and says he made a short trip with the vehicle, shut it off, came back, and it wouldn't restart readily. They're sitting there with the thing cranking over well, but it won't quite catch. It sounds like it's trying a bit, but it won't quite catch. That's typically the scenario of a flooded engine. When we talk about a flooded engine, what we're talking about is an engine that has so much raw fuel, unburned gasoline, in its cylinders that it actually wets the tip of the spark plug with raw gasoline. When that situation happens, the engine is not going to want to restart, and that's what we call flooding. Now, the procedure that you may have been familiar with the older cars with carburetors still applies today. With those old carbureted cars, you probably remember you held your foot right to the floor while cranking, and the thing would start to pick up, splutter, kick, and probably get going. Well, you were doing all of that clear flood procedure mechanically. Wide open throttle, opened the throttle blades, and by holding it right on the floor, that carbureted car had a feature we refer to as the choke unloader, which mechanically tipped the choke plate open. When you come to a fuel-injected late model car, which is almost all of the cars on the road today, this is done electronically. You have no choke plate in these cars. When you initiate cranking with your foot at wide open throttle, the computer in the vehicle recognizes those two things. When it sees cranking and wide open throttle simultaneously, it knows that only means one thing, that you're trying to restart a flooded engine. And what it does is electronically, it cuts the pulse width back on the injectors. In other words, limits the amount of fuel going into the engine. And by keeping your foot wide open, you've opened the throttle blades and allowed a lot of extra air into that engine. You'll start to hear the thing crank a little bit better and kick and splutter and try to get going. Keep your foot right to the floor as you're doing this and listen carefully. When that thing finally gets going and does catch and start, it's going to load up and run really bad for a few seconds. Listen carefully, and as it starts to catch and go, pull your foot gradually out of the throttle so you don't over rev the engine. What you've done here is electronically clear flooded that engine by initiating cranking and wide open throttle. It's as valid today as it was on those old cars with carburetors. Till next week, I'm Bill Gardner for Motoring 98.
They respected Liz in the lab. She was a PhD. But no one knew how much fizz there was to Liz until...
Only Mustang makes it happen. Only Mustang makes life great. Mustang rules you. Mustang rules you. Mustang 68.
In her 68 Mustang Fastback, the PhD was pure TNT. Mustang 68, with great options like stereo radio and selection. Mustang, the original. A better idea than ever for 68. Nowadays, things are really bubbling because, as Liz can tell you, a PhD helps, but...
Only
has a better idea.
Donovan Bailey and Princess Diana. Now there's an odd couple for you, but collectively they've taught us something about car crashes. And that is, if you're going to have a big one, wear your seatbelt. The only person wearing a belt in Diana's car did survive, and so did Bailey, and this massive shunt he had into a telephone pole. Now Bailey said he had a couple of seconds warning before he knew he was going to hit this pole. He said he relaxed his body, and that helped him avoid serious injury. Well, Donovan, if you had a couple of seconds, maybe some braking, maybe some steering, give it some thought. The other interesting thing about Bailey's crash is that he didn't stick around. He flagged a ride from a passerby who took him on home. And I started to think, let's say somebody had had a few beers. I'm not saying Donovan did, but if somebody was drunk and has a big crash and still intelligent enough to think, you realize, wow, if the cops catch me now, I'm going to get drunk driving or care and control of a vehicle, serious criminal charges. If you go home, you're only going to get charged with leaving the scene. I mean, that's a highway traffic act. Cost you a few points, but it's not as serious as drunk driving. Now, I'm not trying to give the bad guys clues here, like go home, have a few beers in front of witnesses and say, okay, now I'm drunk, but I wasn't then. How can they prove anything? But it's up to the lawmakers to start looking at some of these loopholes. They've patched it in the breathalyzer case. If you refuse to take the test, they assume you're guilty. Maybe if you leave the scene of the accident, maybe they should assume you're guilty too. I'm Jim Kenzie.
You know what I really enjoy about driving cars like this NSX on Motoring? It's the fact that we don't have to pay for them. The sad part is, though, we always have to take them back. Well, that's it for now. We'll see you next week for more stories about cars and the people who drive them.
If you're paying $40,000 for a car, you expect them to have very good lights. But in North America, there are no standards. So if you want headlight power, you need to test drive it.
TSN's Motoring 98 has been brought to you by Quaker State. The big Q stands for quality, always has, always will. And Midas, for new, longer-lasting performance friction carbon metallic brake pads.